In this lecture, I wish to follow up on the development of Islam on the eve of the Crusades. We're going to concentrate on the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. These are people who speak an agglutinative language from Central Asia, who enter the Islamic world in the 11th century. In some ways, they're quite destructive, but in the political and military sphere, they're responsible for regenerating the authority of the Abbasid Caliphate. In the last lecture, I had concluded with the Islamic world as essentially divided between two great authorities, the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. And the breaking of this political deadlock, or stalemate, was a result of the Seljuk Turks, who entered into the Middle East and gave their loyalty to the caliphs of Baghdad and restored Sunni Islam, the authority of the Abbasid caliphs, and regenerated Islamic military power. This is the first of the important steppe nomads of Central Asia who swept into the Middle East during the Middle Ages and transformed society. There will be another great such migration in the 13th century, that is the Mongols, who will appear later in this series, and they will not be so friendly to Islam as we shall see. But in the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks arrived as recent converts. They identified with Sunni Islam, and therefore what I'd like to start with is sketching who these Seljuk Turks are, why they embraced Islam, what made them so inclined, and then to look at the careers of the great Seljuk sultans. Those would be the Sultan Tughril Bey, his nephew Alp Arslan, and finally Malik Shah, who were responsible for rejuvenating Islamic power, and then conclude with what the implications of this new Seljuk Sultanate was for not only the Byzantine world, but also for the Western Europeans, and why the arrival of the Seljuk Turks are really responsible for the launching of the Crusades. Well, let's get to the first question, and that is the matter of who are these Seljuk Turks. Certainly, sometime between the late 4th and the 7th centuries AD, there was, if not a demographic, certainly a linguistic change on the great Eurasian steppes that stretch from the Danube all the way to the boundaries of northern China. On these steppes, traditionally, there were nomadic peoples, perhaps beginning in the early Iron Age, who had learned how to practice the seasonal pastoralism associated with steppe nomads. And this is a very complicated pattern of using land, that is, following the seasons in order to herd your animals, horses, goats, sheep, and they became quite expert in exploiting the land to sustain their herds. Initially, the steppe nomads, at least in the western arm of that great steppe zone, going from the Danube to, say, Central Asia, stretching across southern Russia today, were primarily inhabited by people who spoke Iranian dialects. But in the early Middle Ages, these people were displaced by people speaking Turkic languages, and we think the first of these were actually the Huns. So, by the 11th century, the whole of the steppes, from really the lower Danube, stretching across southern Russia into Central Asia to the borders of the Chinese Empire, that is north of Tibet to the very western fringes of the Chinese Empire, were linguistically a related area. That is, there were various Turkish dialects spoken. On the other hand, these people had differentiated themselves in different types of tribes and clans. Turkomen, which specifically refers to the nomadic Turkish speaker rather than a Turk, who is technically a person who speaks Turkish, is not necessarily a nomad. Turkomen society was based on the herding of animals, the shared relationships of different kinship groups, often called in Turkish the yurt, that is the basic unit of Turkish society. And I believe in modern Turkish, at least in modern Turkey, that's survived as a student's dormitory, which is a rather extended use of the term. Of course, these units of the yurt were important in exploiting the grasslands and building the pillars of early Turkish society. When the Islamic armies overran the Sassanid Empire of Persia in the 7th century and reached the great rivers of the Jaxartes and Oxus, which are the two great eastern rivers that separate the Iranian world from the Central Steppes. And they occupied the great caravan centers of Burr, Bukhara, and Samarkand. The Islamic armies were now the heirs to a problem which Persian shahs had faced, and that is how to secure this eastern frontier. Because the people they faced across the frontier were various Turkoman tribes who had settled there at least since the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Now, the Turkoman warriors they encountered already had perfected their methods in nomadic warfare, in light cavalry tactics. The Turkoman always had pride in the Ghazi, the heroic warrior, often armed with a composite bow, riding his sturdy horse, really more of a pony than a horse. I mean, it's a rather small but very rugged animal that could live on the Central Asian steppes, traveling great distances. They were equipped with armor, but it was very often a type of scale armor, often made out of leather rather than metal. As they gained more money through trade, they would equip themselves with metal armor, with the helmets and the equipment you would see in Abbasid or Chinese armies. But fundamentally, their tactics were based on cavalry attacks in which they would attack their opponent and shower him with arrows, annoy him, draw him into an ill-conceived charge where eventually the attacking force would break up because the Turks, on their very swift horses, would simply retreat and wear down their opponent, reappear and attack. This sort of desultory fighting that eventually the psychological morale of the opponent would break, and the Turks would then move in and mop up. They were superb horsemen, they were excellent bowmen, and in close hand-to-hand fighting, very impressive with scimitar and mace. And therefore, they were always appreciated as warriors by the settled societies. The Persian shahs had used them, that is the Zoroastrian shahs of the Persian Empire. The early Islamic caliphs came to the same conclusion. Turkish warriors were some of the finest men you could hire. And many of the eastern armies of Islam had large regiments of Turkish soldiers. Now, sometimes these fellows were recruited as tribal regiments. But very frequently, starting in the 9th and 10th century, they were also purchased as slaves. This was because there was endemic fighting among the various Turkoman tribes of Central Asia, and the victims were usually the defeated in such wars, and they were simply sold off. And young men were prized. They were brought in, purchased at certain slave markets in Central Asia. These Turks were then removed into Baghdad. There was actually a very powerful Turkish bodyguard in the Abbasid Caliphate, which tended to do such things as riot, kill caliphs, and dominate politics. But the military power of the Turks was already long recognized before the Seljuk Turks actually arrived in the Middle East in force. In addition, the Turks of Central Asia found Islam very congenial. Now, obviously, many of them may have picked it up as they entered into military service, but there was extensive trade that connected these cities of northeastern Iran and the cities of Central Asia with the Chinese Empire, stretching across this great Tarim Basin, which is the link, which means the caravans usually skirted the western and northern edges of Tibet. They steered clear of Tibet and entered into China to get silks and various other goods and bring them back in the other direction. And these trade routes needed protection. Turkoman tribes hired themselves out to defend caravans or extorted blackmail. It was often more a matter of degree whether you were hired or hiring them or paying blackmail. And as a result, they acquired Islam through contact with merchants. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, by the 9th and 10th centuries, many of the merchants had converted to Islam. It was to their advantage in the Abbasid Caliphate. So the Turks saw these merchants as the agents of higher civilization, as coming from the Abbasid Caliph. They also found in the teachings of Islam elements that corresponded with their own beliefs. Most of them seem to have been devoted to their ancestors and had what is often called by anthropologists a shamanist religion, that is, believing in the spirits of the ancestors, with shamans who could be in communication with the other world, often induced by the use of mind-altering substances such as hashish and the like. And that meant that the Dashamid, that is the Turkish holy man or spiritual man, could easily be linked to the Islamic Imam or Mahdi, that is, men who had visions of the other world. And this made Islam, in its folk form, very congenial to many of the Turks. And it's often been put, and this is actually based on the original sources, that the Central Asian steppe nomads, on the whole, were probably destined to convert to Islam because of these religious traditions. And it essentially runs along a line of whether you go Christian or whether you go Muslim, and that line is the hashish vodka line. If you lived in the forest zones of Russia, you were probably going to embrace Orthodox Christianity that allowed for the drinking of vodka. And we're told that in the Russian Primary Chronicle was one of the great attractions of Christianity to the early Russians. But if you were steppe nomad types, Turkish speakers along the steppes, then Islam was more congenial since vodka wasn't so important to you. You didn't have to get through the Russian winters. And the traditions of your holy man were easily incorporated into the Islamic traditions, and you tended to incline to Islam. Now, it's not 100%. We have one group of Turkish speakers, the Khazars, in the 9th century, baffling everyone by converting to Judaism. But in any case, on the whole, these lines more or less hold in Central Asia. And by the 11th century, many of the Turkish tribes, at least nominally, had embraced some form of Sunni Islam, the Islam that had emanated out of Baghdad. The result is that by the opening of the 11th century, as the Islamic world is in this political deadlock, that the Turks were probably one of the most effective military powers on the fringes of the Islamic world. They had already been settled as military colonists in several sections of the Islamic world. In Khorasan, particularly in northern Iran, there were important Turkish settlements, and that settlement was important for a variety of reasons, because as the Turks come into contact with the civilized world or the settled world, not only do they pick up Islam, they also pick up various cultural institutions that would include everything from rug making to architecture, and those traditions are going to be largely Persian, Iranian. And when the Turks arrive in the Middle East, they are in some ways the heirs, the bringers not only of Sunni Islam, but they're also the bringers of an Iranian-based culture in the 11th and 12th century. And that will have important implications later. Out of these wars, these constant tribal wars on the frontiers, a remarkable figure by the name of Tughril Bey emerged in 1037. And he put together a series of tribes. He's the first of the Seljuk sultans, and Seljuk simply is a term referring to their descent from a mythical ancestor, who defeated rivals and consolidated these tribes into an effective army. By 1040, he had defeated several important rivals, most notably the Ghaznavid armies. This was the leading emir, that is, local authority in eastern Iran that more or less represented the Abbasid Caliphate. The Seljuk Turks were also very good in driving off Turkish tribes that were either not converted or only partially converted to Islam, and securing the caravan routes. And so they won a lot of good points with the caravan centers such as Merv and Samarkand in ensuring the flow of trade and prosperity. From that position, they moved into Iran and steadily captured Iranian cities and overthrew opposing regimes. The most curious of the regimes were a group of emirs and emir is the Arab word for a governor, someone operating as a subordinate to the caliph in Baghdad. The most curious of these were the so-called Buyyid emirs, who ruled in western Iran and apparently were inclined towards Shiite traditions, and yet had acted as sort of the indirect guardians of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was a very strange political arrangement in the late 10th century that characterized the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate. Well, these fellows were swept away. And in 1055, Tughril Bey entered the city of Baghdad after extinguishing all these opponents in Iran and Iraq and restored the authority of the then reigning caliph, a fellow named Al-Qamin, who was essentially a figurehead, and was married to the daughter of Tughril Bey. The Abbasid caliph then invested Tughril Bey with documents and authority that made him sultan, which was a Turkish term that meant guardian. And this is an important shift in Islam. The caliph still was the religious and political authority of Sunni Islam and was descended from Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, according to what the Abbasids claimed. However, he now entrusted to his Turkish general the military power to wage war. And what will happen over the course of the 11th and 12th century is that various Turkish commanders, dynasts, under terms such as emir or sultan, will carve out states with their tribal army of Turks, who became the dominant military force of the Middle East, but will legitimize themselves by receiving the commission from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. And that particularly was expressed in the call to prayer, which occurs 5 times daily for Muslims, that the name of the caliph in Baghdad would be called out rather than the caliph in Cairo. It meant on the coinage issued by the Turkish commanders that the name of the caliph in Baghdad would be named. It might also have the name of the local dynast as well. But there were a variety of official ways of recognizing the fact that these Turkish generals, in effect, operated with the sanction and authority of the Abbasid Caliph. Now, Tughril Bey proved to be a superb general. Furthermore, his Turkoman tribes, who had come through Iran, found certain areas of the Near East quite congenial for settlement. The first of these is the grasslands known as the Al Jazeera, which still have Turkoman people living there today. And these are the grasslands of northern Iraq. It would be northeastern Syria and actually southern Turkey today, which stretch across the Euphrates. There were grasslands that were easily exploited, ideal for the settlement of Turkoman tribes. And this area becomes a center of Turkish settlement. And through the whole era of the Crusades, many of the best Turkish soldiers that opposed the Crusades are coming from this region. Another area, as it turned out, was Central Anatolia, that is Central Asia Minor, after 1071, which is opened up to Turkish settlement. And so there will be areas where the Turks will settle in numbers in the Near East. Tughril Bey, as I mentioned in 2 previous lectures, was primarily interested in taking on the Fatimid caliphs, who represented the most dangerous opponent. Furthermore, the Fatimids controlled Medina and Mecca, which were the holy cities of Islam, and therefore, just by the control of those cities, had some measure of legitimacy. They were also associated with all the different sectarians across eastern Iran, Shiite and Aliyad, that posed continual threats to the Abbasid regime. And so the Turkoman armies moved west to fight the Fatimid armies. And that was always the prime objective of the sultans in Baghdad. Tughril Bey waged a war down to his death in 1063. Then his nephew, Alp Arslan, when he took over, again, primarily focused his attentions on the Fatimid armies. And there were some important victories scored in capturing cities in Syria and in Palestine. However, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, the Turkish sultans were also very conscious of the fact that the Fatimids were in alliance with the Byzantines. And they had released many of their Turkoman warriors to attack the Byzantine army, largely as a protective measure. That was to secure their flank as they moved against the Fatimids, to make sure the Byzantines would not give aid to their traditional ally. They also found Asia Minor very quickly an area where they could release various Turkoman tribal regiments onto the Christian populations and gain a lot of prestige in the eyes of the Muslims. And this requires us to slow down a bit and see how the Muslims reacted to this arrival of the Turks. They militarily and politically regenerated Baghdad. There's no doubt about it. But through the whole era of the Crusades, the Turkish military elite was unpopular in the eyes of most Muslims. They were seen as disruptive. They were seen as barbarians. They were notorious for drinking, that is, alcoholic beverages, such as raka. Their Islam was very suspect in the eyes of many Muslim theologians. Furthermore, they tended to be extremely rapacious. Whenever Turkish armies were settled on urban populations, there were always incidents. It didn't matter to most of the inhabitants of Syria and Iraq whether their livestock was taken by Fatimid armies or Turkmen armies in the name of the Abbasid Caliph. And the Turks very quickly acquired a reputation of being ferocious warriors and very hard masters. And that is a point that must be stressed continually, that the Turkish military elite was largely, I often put it, the Turks were the Muslim equivalent of the Normans in some ways, although the Normans were never quite as unpopular as the Turks were in the eyes of other Muslims. But the Turks were seen as this disruptive element. So by attacking the Byzantine Empire, not only did it secure an important military position, it also allowed Tughril Bey and Alp Arslan to send into Asia Minor against the infidel, against the Christian, military regiments, tribal regiments that otherwise would have to be quartered in Islamic cities. The result was very quickly they discovered that there was very little Byzantine resistance. In 1064, they captured two key Armenian cities, Ani and Kars, that had only recently come under Byzantine control. And from those positions, they were able to raid across Asia Minor. This provoked the Byzantine reaction that led to the disastrous battle at Manzikert in 1071. And these raids through the 1060s and 1070s revealed to the Turks very quickly that the central plateau of Asia Minor, the 50% core of that peninsula, had a climate and terrain very similar to Central Asia. And as I've noted on a number of occasions, it's as if a fragment of Central Asia had been thrust into the middle of a Mediterranean peninsula. And in these regions, the Turks migrated in large numbers while the main armies were engaged in battling the Fatimid caliphs. Well, as a result, the 1070s and 1080s saw the success of Turkish arms. Alp Arslan died shortly after his brilliant victory over Romanus IV at Manzikert. He was succeeded by Malik Shah in 1072, who assumed the position of Sultan of the Grand Seljuk Empire, which now stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean almost to India and well into Central Asia. But with Malik Shah, we noticed an important point, and that is the political power of this Seljuk Empire begins to fragment. There were too many commitments, and there was also a tradition among the Seljuk Turks to parcel out power among one's descendants. And so Malik Shah, who resided in Baghdad and was primarily concerned with the eastern half of the empire, assigned authority to his brother, a fellow called Tutush, who took over the war against the Fatimids. And it is this commander who drove into Syria. It was his forces that in 1086 captured the city of Antioch, and it was probably his forces who began to disrupt the pilgrimage trade of Western Europeans into Syria in the 1080s, which was part of the background for the Crusades. Other Turkish groups who apparently operated independently of both Tutush and Malik Shah migrated into Asia Minor and carved out their own states in Central Asia Minor. And these were eventually accepted as Seljuk powers, although really Malik Shah had very little authority over these fellows in Asia Minor. The most important was a Turkoman Ghazi, a Ghazi warrior by the name of Suleiman, who seized several important cities in Asia Minor. Foremost, the city of Iconium, which is renamed in Turkish as Konya, where he built a Turkish state on the plateau of Asia Minor. He later captured the city of Nicaea, Iznik today in Turkey, and Konya is still regarded as the most sacred city in Turkey. This particular state saw Constantinople as its major objective. They were going to, they actually called themselves the Sultans of Rum, which is a Turkish adaptation of the Arabic word Rum, which means Rome. They saw themselves, in effect, as the successors, the Muslim Turkish successors of Rome. This group, which by the 1070s had consolidated power on the Turkish plateau, on the Anatolian plateau, began to interfere with pilgrimage routes going through Asia Minor. So by the 1070s, 1080s, the whole of that land pilgrimage route, which had been set up by Basil II, was very much jeopardized. There were a number of Turkish settlers in Asia Minor, but the second important group was a fellow by the name of Malik Danishmend, who seized control of northeastern Turkey and styled himself as an emir, the traditional Arabic term for a governor. And he seized the important modern Turkish cities of Sivas, Niksar, Tokat, Amasya. These are cities along a very ancient trade route, Byzantine military highway that linked Central Asia Minor, Konya, and the more westerly Sultanate of Konya with the Near East. Had routes leading into the Al Jazeera, it had routes leading into Iran. This Turkish group became particularly important during the period of the Crusades. They were the route through which Turkish armies could move from attacks on the Byzantine Empire into Syria and vice versa. And both these states were firmly established by the time the Emperor Alexis I came to the throne in 1081. And both areas are still some of the most conservative areas in Turkey, because this is where the original Turkish settlement was. In Syria, the position of the Seljuk Turks became even more complex. Tutush died in 1095, and immediately his sons divided authority. There was one son, Dukwak, who ruled in Damascus. There was another one, Ridvan, who ruled in Aleppo. And the Turkish position in Syria and the Al Jazeera became as fragmented as Asia Minor. This all on the very eve of the Crusades. That numerically, these Turkish armies posed an impressive threat. But politically, they had become so divided by 1095, just before the First Crusade was preached, that it played to the advantage of the Crusades. And in the meanwhile, the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo continued to hold on to many of the ports of Palestine, the Levant, and Jerusalem, so that the political situation from the Islamic viewpoint had become quite fragmented. In the case of the Turks of Asia Minor, in many ways, the government in Constantinople saw these Turks as a mixed blessing, rather than just as a foe. The Turks moved into Asia Minor as a military elite. They employed apostate Christians and Persians as their ruling officials. But on the other hand, the Turks in Asia Minor were fairly remote, fairly much on the fringe of the Islamic world. And while the Byzantines did need military aid from the Western Europeans to defeat these Turks and bring them back under their authority, it was not without some reason that the Emperor Alexis I and his successors thought at least the Turks of Asia Minor might be assimilated into the Byzantine Commonwealth, might be converted. After all, their Islam was very much a folk Islam. It was an attachment to Islam based on identifying traditional shamanist traditions with Islamic traditions. It was hard to reinforce these Turks at this point because there was so much fighting going on in the Middle East. Furthermore, the vast majority of residents in Asia Minor continued to be Christians. They continued to be Greek speakers, or in southeastern Turkey, they were Armenians. In the Great Taurus Mountains, in the southeastern coastal zone known as Cilicia, and also in the traditional Armenian homeland, there were large numbers of Armenian Christians who asserted their independence. So by the year 1096, with the launching of the First Crusade, the Islamic world briefly promised a reunification under the Seljuk Turks, now found itself even more politically divided. To be sure, the Abbasid Caliphate had been militarily rejuvenated. But those agents of rejuvenation, that is, the Seljuk Turks, had divided themselves into a series of competing dynasts. In turn, the Fatimid Caliphs still held on to Egypt. In 1098, they actually reoccupied Jerusalem. So they had not only Jerusalem, but the holy cities. And as the irony is that in this great struggle between the two caliphates, unwittingly, the Seljuk Turks had sparked a reaction among Western Europeans that would launch the Great Crusades.